Welcome back. And we've spoken about an introduction to different terminologies. We've spoken about the CIA triad. We've explained what risk is. Now let's take a look at threats and vulnerabilities. We can categorize our threats. We can say we will face accidental threats and deliberate threats, internal threats and external threats to our information security landscape. Some examples of accidental threats include human error, which is a real common issue within the workplace. Human error, where someone accidentally exposes confidential information. Malfunctions, fire, flood. These are all examples of accidental threats. Deliberate threats include hacking, malicious software, sabotage, cyber terrorism, high-tech crime, money laundering. Sources of accidental threats could include our internal employees. Our internal employees could accidentally expose our information assets to risk. Trusted partners, poor software design, weak procedures and processes, or non-existent procedures and processes, managed services and news groups. All of these pose threats to our information security landscape. But the biggest threat of all is a lack of procedures. If the InfoSec manager, senior management, CISO is not prepared to create procedures, not prepared to create policies, then there can be no plans. There can't be any monitoring on the infrastructure without any procedures, without any policies in place. So first things first, we always need to establish that there are sound procedures in place to seek to thwart the risk of a successful cyber attack against our organizations. Other threats to InfoSec: theft, the theft of information, designs, intellectual property, as well as the theft of money. Most thefts, most fraud is committed using computers nowadays. Sabotage, the willful and malicious destruction of property, including information. What about our users who accidentally click on emails and PDF links? That's why we hold phishing campaigns, to try and increase the awareness to the end user, to try and increase that risk, rather to try and reduce the risk to the enterprise, but to try and increase the awareness to the users about the threat of malicious software entering our infrastructure, compromising our information assets due to users clicking on links, malicious links within emails or PDFs. Social engineering is a real threat to organizations. Blackmail and extortion, that is another threat to security. What is blackmail or extortion? That is the unlawful demand of money or property under threat to do harm. I've had to spread this message loud and clear in some organizations I've previously encountered. That is, if we're not mindful of the information that we create and store on our information assets, within our emails, we could place our organizations at an increased risk of blackmail or extortion, whereby a cyber criminal seeks to demand money or property of the organization with a threat to do harm if their demands are not met. Industrial espionage, competitors and foreign governments tend to seek out business secrets or government secrets, official secrets, to try to gain an advantage over their competitor or over other governments. Some governments employ hundreds and thousands of cyber criminals to spy on their foreign governments, on other governments, just to seek out secrets. Some firms will also employ hackers to try to gain information into their competitors. There's a threat to advances in technology, such as to driverless cars, military equipment, and medical devices. We read up every single day of ransomware attacks, successful ransomware attacks against various organizations. And that should serve as a reminder that nowhere is actually safe. Another threat to security, unauthorized disclosure, disclosure of trade secrets, disclosure of company secrets, and privacy law violations. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, the UK Data Protection Act 2018. Privacy law violations are a real risk to organizations where users, third-party suppliers need to be made aware of our obligations to protect the privacy of our customers and employees alike. Loss of credibility and brand reputation. There's a real risk to organizations of losing their credibility, their brand, their share price, reputation, if they experience a data breach or a massive cyber attack against the company's information assets. Another threat is the loss of trade secrets. And once disclosed, or once accessed by cyber criminals and then disclosed on the internet, that then becomes irretractable information. And there are usually legal repercussions in some instances, such as when there's a breach of personal data of our customers or our employees. Threat actors? Well, we all know what a hacker is. They can break in or damage or discredit legitimate IT processing. They can be internal hackers. They can be external hackers. They can also be ethical hackers, also referred to as penetration testers or pen testers. Ethical hackers are authorized to hack and attack an organization's controls to try and identify weaknesses. But on the other hand, we need to be mindful to conduct background checks of our ethical hackers or penetration test companies that we may actually employ, simply because if we employ An ethical hacker, without any background checks, they may be tempted to exploit any vulnerabilities or weaknesses that they identify if these are not remediated promptly and thoroughly. Employee betrayal. Employees may deem that they've been mistreated, and then they go and misuse their legitimate credentials, access credentials, to cause harm to the organization's information assets. So good practice dictates that we recertify the access of all our users, including privileged users, in the eventuality of a major breach. Many of us may remember the Morrisons story. So Morrisons is a UK large supermarket brand where a disgruntled contractor accessed the data of employees and published that data online. So that was personal data of employees, which he accessed, and then he published it online. Again, that was an internal contractor, so an internal threat actor. Third parties, vendors, contractors, consultants we've hired, auditors, maintenance staff, cleaners. Cleaners have access to our offices once we've gone home, when we're in bed in some instances. They may pick up a confidential piece of information from the floor behind a desk and they throw it away. They throw that confidential information away when it should have been retained securely by the owner of that information. So maintenance staff, cleaners, vendors, contractors may all have access to information and knowledge that can be used against the organization or that can be accidentally disposed of. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, but employees may actually unwittingly, unknowingly assist a crime, accidentally assist a crime by disclosing their password, by leaving a secure room door ajar for a threat actor to enter, an unauthorized person to enter. So ignorance of the law is not an excuse. If we have lax standards in place, if our workplaces are insecure or we allow weak passwords, we're enabling threat actors to our information assets. So let's take a look at different impacts. The impact on the business of the loss or impairment to an asset includes the loss of information, the loss of critical systems, the loss of sales, the loss of share value, the loss of opportunities. In some cases, that could lead to an impact on our reputation, an intangible asset, because we can't necessarily put a price to our reputation. So the impact on our reputation may lead to a loss of customers, which may then lead to an impact on a company's ability to continue in business, because without information, we cannot continue in business for that long. Other threat actors, deliberate threats, internal employees, trusted partners, random attackers, a targeted attack, managed and outsourced services. So we face various threat actors, and the threats they pose could result in a variety of impacts. What is a vulnerability? That is a weakness that could be exploited. A vulnerability is a weakness in our controls. The lack of updated or up-to-date antivirus is a vulnerability or a weakness that could be exploited by a threat actor. The lack of strong passwords, the lack of multi-factor authentication is a vulnerability that could be exploited. The lack of any procedures, the lack of a policy, the lack of senior management buy-in is a weakness or a vulnerability that could be exploited. Vulnerability scans can actually identify known vulnerabilities in a system, but not unknown vulnerabilities. Here are some different categories of vulnerabilities. Weaknesses in software. So where we've got default passwords left in software, for example. Default router passwords. So when our router is sent through by the router provider, that consists of a default password, which is possibly available on the internet, on the dark web. So if we leave that default password in place when we're configuring our router for our live infrastructure, we're leaving a vulnerability of a known password in place. Weaknesses in software, hardware, buildings and facilities. Consider our loading bay areas. How secure is that? People. Weaknesses in people, we've talked about the accidental threat or the deliberate threat that people, including employees, may pose to our infrastructure and our information assets. Procedures, inadequate procedures. Different system types include PCs, laptops, handheld devices, mobile devices, each having their unique vulnerabilities. A desktop PC that is left on a desktop in a secure room doesn't hold the same or doesn't pose the same vulnerabilities, not as weak as having a laptop that is transported between home and office every single day in a laptop bag. Mobile devices come with a whole load, a whole raft of vulnerabilities. The client and server environment in the workplace. Vulnerabilities exist there where you've got a single server serving a vast number of users and their PCs, in many cases across regional links. We've got network devices, wireless systems, web servers, email systems. Each hosts their unique vulnerabilities and weaknesses. When we're considering our vulnerabilities, identifying those vulnerabilities, considering them, we need to consider the threats, vulnerabilities, and asset value to the overall corporate risk landscape. How big is this threat, this vulnerability, this asset value to the overall corporate risk landscape, to the overall picture? We need to consider the business impact of realized threats. If this vulnerability were to be exploited, what would be the impact on the business? Would it mean a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability? Might it lead to financial loss, brand damage, loss of confidence in the business? So when we're considering our vulnerabilities, we're not just taking a look at things from a technical perspective, from a software perspective or a tools perspective. Rather, we're taking a look at a business perspective. What is an asset? Something that has value to the organization, which may be tangible, where we can place a price on it, or intangible, such as reputation. The calculation of the value of an asset could be difficult or almost impossible in many instances. When you buy a server where all the corporate information is stored, let's say you're a small legal firm or so you buy a server and you place all the documents, all the information assets of your small business on that server. How do you calculate the value of the information rather than the value of the server itself, which could be depreciated over a number of years? So when we're talking about the value of information, in many cases, it's difficult or almost impossible to calculate. An organization may suffer badly if an asset is lost or impaired. Remember TalkTalk? Up until last year, following their data breach, about 4 years ago, they didn't recover their share price. Up until last year, their share price, actually, I think that they haven't recovered their share price yet, that they were actually enjoying and benefiting from before the data breach, which occurred around 2015. Their share price is currently at about 50% to 60% of what it was in 2015. So an organization may suffer irreparable damages if an asset is lost or impaired. We also consider the likelihood. How likely is it that the vulnerability will be exploited and that the risk will occur? So likelihood and probability mean the same thing. We can assess the likelihood and the probability qualitatively or quantitatively. When we're considering our qualitative risk assessment, we're taking a look at whether the risk is high, medium, or low. When we're conducting our quantitative risk assessment, which is my preferred method, we're taking a look at the percentage likelihood and calculable impact of the risk if it were to materialize. When we're talking qualitative risk assessments, we're having to employ a high degree of subjectivity, where we're guessing to a large extent. Whereas when we're considering the quantitative risk assessment, we're being a bit more objective, where we're introducing calculations. What is a risk? A vulnerability that could be exploited by a threat is a risk. So if there is no threat, but there is a vulnerability, so there's a vulnerability, but there's no threat to that vulnerability, then that means that there's no risk. If there's a threat, but there's no vulnerability to be exploited, again, there is no risk. So a vulnerability is a weakness. A threat is a deliberate or accidental actor that could exploit a vulnerability. And that would result in a risk. A vulnerability that could be exploited by a threat is a risk. So we could give an example of a PC that has not been patched for 6 months. The vulnerability or the weakness is that the PC has not been patched for 6 months. The threat to that PC is a hacker or malicious software. And so that PC, that unpatched PC, presents a risk to the business because there's a probability that that unpatched PC could be exploited by a hacker. That is the risk. And risk exposure is the combination of the impact times the likelihood or probability. The impact times likelihood. What is the risk management process or the risk assessment process? How do we assess a risk? We first start by identifying the risk. If you don't identify the risk, you cannot assess it. Then we now conduct our risk analysis, where we take a look at risk treatments and we select the appropriate risk treatment. Then we mitigate the risk by treating it, and then we monitor on an ongoing basis. So let's take a look at different risk treatments. We've got avoid or terminate, which means to stop the activity. If you want to avoid a risk or terminate a risk, you can just stop the activity, stop the information processing, stop your recruitment team, stop recruiting to the business, stop the activity. If you stop the activity, you then avoid the risk, the identified risk. You can reduce the risk by implementing controls. So say the risk is to your recruitment data. You've identified a risk that your recruitment data could be hacked into, your recruitment database could be hacked into by a cyber criminal. You could stop hosting your recruitment database and simply avoid recruitment. That would be to avoid or terminate the activity. You can also choose to reduce the risk of that database from being hacked into, in which case you implement controls. You could implement multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication meaning that you require employees to enter 2 types of authentication or deploy 2 types of authentication methods, including maybe a password or a passphrase, which is a type 1 authentication method. And then they could also present a token, smart card. So that is a type 2 authentication method. So you implement controls to reduce the risk. Again, that doesn't eliminate the risk, doesn't avoid the risk, but it simply reduces the risk. So we implement controls and countermeasures to reduce risk. We could transfer the risk of that database being hacked into by insuring against the risk. When we insure, we're insuring against the impact of that database being hacked into, whereby we say in the event that this database is hacked into our recruitment database, then we would like to insure and be compensated financially. We could also outsource the activity of recruitment. That is another method of risk transference. If we outsource the database, then that means we're outsourcing to a company that may have more specialist skills than us to maintain and secure that database. In which case, we're transferring the probability of the risk, not the impact, but the probability. Because if the database is hacked into with a third-party provider, we still retain accountability for that database. So we're transferring, when we outsource, we're transferring the probability, but not the financial impact, unless we include in our third-party clause, information security clause, unless we include a clause that simply states, in the event that a breach occurs that is your fault, then we would like to be compensated financially. Another risk treatment is to accept the risk. Risk acceptance is a written and signed decision from the senior management team, in most cases when the cost of controls are greater than the benefits to be derived. So if the cost of transferring the risk or the cost of implementing multi-factor authentication outweighs the benefits to be derived from securing that recruitment database, then senior management may choose to accept the risk, in which case they need to sign against that risk. They sign off against that risk. So acceptance is a written and signed decision from the senior management team stroke board. What types of controls do we have? Well, first of all, we've got preventative controls, which seek to prevent an information asset breach. We've got directive controls, which include management policies. We've got detective controls, which seek to identify the breach of our information assets. Then we've got corrective controls that correct the breach. We'll talk about those later. We've also got physical controls, such as gates or fences around our data center, man traps, which only allow one human to go in at a time to data centers, for example. So man traps, physical controls. We've got procedural controls, including procedure manuals. We've got technical controls, including our tokens, and then we've got management controls. Risk management, so we've talked about the qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. These are different approaches. We can also use software tools to calculate our risk. We can use questionnaires, usually for the qualitative risk assessment process. And the reason for risk analysis and risk assessment is to identify and account for the value of information assets before we actually can present to the senior management team our risk assessments. Information classification is a tool that can help us to identify our most critical assets that need to be secured, that we need to apply controls to. Our risk assessment, again, should be in business terms, not in technology terms. When we're talking about protecting our information assets, we need to be able to make recommendations to senior management, to the board, in business terms. We don't want to bombard them with information about the latest security tool, about the latest firewall, about the latest software out there. Rather, how can we add value to the business by securing our critical information assets? When we're doing our risk analysis assessment, we look at the cost of information security versus the cost of potential losses. This tool to protect this information asset will cost X, Y, Z. But here's how much we could potentially lose in the event we do not protect or secure this information asset. The board accepts risk, senior management accepts risk, as I said previously, and we need to maintain all of this information in a corporate risk register. What is the goal, or what are the goals of risk management? Number one, we're doing our risk management so that we can identify the most serious risk to the business. And number two, once we've identified those risks, we seek to reduce that risk to an acceptable level, not to eliminate risk, but to reduce risk to an acceptable level. All businesses have to take part in risky activities. The board has to be prepared to accept a certain level of risk to do business. The only way we can eliminate this is if we were to close down the company, if we were to not do business. So the goal of risk management is not to eliminate risk, but simply to help the business to reduce any identified risks to an acceptable level for the board to then sign off on. All IT systems have risk, as I've just said, so it's impossible to eliminate all risk. We need to understand our risks once we've identified these, and then we empower senior management to make good decisions. Once we've completed our risk assessments, we provide all the information that we have, non-technical jargon, to senior management to empower them to make good decisions. Our asset valuation, as I keep saying, we have both tangible and intangible valued assets. Our job is to consider all possible threats and present that information to senior management as clearly and comprehensively as possible. What sort of risk assessment method uses feelings and ideas and opinions? That is our qualitative risk assessment. We take a look at scenarios. We do our brainstorming, focus groups, surveys, questionnaires, checklists, one-on-one meetings with key stakeholders and interviews. And we identify the risks for each asset, for each information asset. Qualitative risk assessment, that's prioritizing the potential impact of each identified risk in terms of the probable effect on the project or business objectives, and treating each risk according to its priority. So this is an example of a RAG matrix, a red, amber, green matrix. A RAG matrix, commonly used in industry. Anything that has a high likelihood and that would have a catastrophic or significant impact within the business is in these red areas, and those are the risks that senior management need to know about, whilst we continue to keep an eye to monitor these green risks and these yellow risks and these amber risks. So we continue to monitor these because they may actually change. A risk that is currently low likelihood and of limited impact may change dependent on market conditions, dependent on times, may actually change and become a significant risk with a high likelihood. So we have to ensure that we keep monitoring our risks, whatever level that they were when we first inputted them into the risk register. Quantitative risk analysis uses financial values to calculate and compare risk, puts an actual financial value on the impact, estimates the likelihood and annual rate of occurrence, and also estimates the single loss expectancy. How much might we lose if this system were to go down, or if this information asset were to be compromised once? How frequently, the annual rate of occurrence, how many times a year do we estimate that this system will go down? So here's a quantitative risk assessment example that I've completed here. So we take a look at the asset value. Very difficult again to calculate an asset value. So a system that I often use is how much revenue this system is bringing in per hour. Let's say you work in an e-commerce organization. So you've got a web server that contains a books database. You can work out how much that server, that web server, has brought in terms of sales per hour over the last year, over the last 2 years, 5 years. That is just one way of calculating an asset value. There are many other ways. But for the purpose of this exercise, we'll use how much revenue the system brings in per hour. Exposure factor, what is the subjective percentage of asset loss per incident? If this server were to go down once, what is our guess of the percentage of asset loss, of sales loss, I'd say, per incident? So I've just used a figure of 30%. That in the event this system were to go down once, then we might lose 30% of that asset value per incident. Single loss expectancy, that is the asset value times the exposure factor. So the asset value is £10,000 here, and the exposure factor is 30%. So that is 10 times 30%, because the calculation is asset value times exposure factor. So 10,000 times 30% is £3,000. Annualized rate of occurrence. So I've said downtime once per year. So annual loss expectancy is single loss expectancy times annualized rate of occurrence. So £30,000 times 10%, or £30,000 times 0.10 equals £3,000 rather than dollars. Controls. We've got preventative controls, such as our locks, our fences, our firewalls, IPSs, intrusion prevention systems, and encryption. These seek to prevent an attack against our information assets. Locks on our server room doors, fences, firewalls that block inbound traffic and control traffic. IPS's intrusion prevention systems that block unauthorized traffic, and encryption that seeks to scramble information being shared into unreadable hashes. These are preventative controls. Detective controls, CCTVs, motion detectors, honeypots. A honeypot is a system that is used to trap cyber criminals, to lure them to a system where an internal information security team can then try and study their methods of attack, try and study what exactly they're seeking to do. Detective controls, reviews of logs. So log reviews, it's important that information security analysts are able to review the different log reports that they'll receive every single day, just to understand, to detect any unauthorized access to the information systems or technologies. And then intrusion detection systems. So the intrusion prevention system prevents, whereas an intrusion detection system simply detects and alerts. Corrective controls include antiviruses and intrusion prevention systems. Intrusion prevention systems can be configured to reset the connection once it has prevented a hacker from gaining a foothold on our infrastructure. When selecting software tools, make sure that you keep your choices simple. I can't actually recommend risk assessment tools to you, but ensure that you choose simple tools that won't distract away from the process of actually assessing the risks to the business. You can include questionnaires and ensure that you involve a sizable focus group to make sure that the feedback that is gained is meaningful. You don't want to send out questionnaires to a handful of people when you're seeking to reach a decision on a risk that relates to a company worth, or rather with 5,000 staff. Ensure you observe the quality of feedback, because you don't want a situation whereby, you're sending a questionnaire out asking what the risk is of a flood to your data center, and you have some individuals saying, well, I believe the risk is high because I went on holiday last year and my holiday was ruined by rainfall. That is not quality feedback. So ensure you observe the quality of feedback. Make sure that anyone providing feedback is actually providing feedback not just based on a one-off experience, rather than having conducted due diligence research into the area. So when sending out questionnaires, try and send out those questionnaires to people who are objective, even though they will be providing subjective feedback in many instances. If you're working for a company that is a global corporation, for example, try and ensure that you get representation from the regions when assessing the risk, rather than simply focus on your home base location. When valuing information assets, the first step is to identify the assets that are in scope. So with your information security program, you won't actually be seeking to secure all of your company's information assets. You may be constrained by regulatory obligations to secure your critical assets or your not so critical assets, but assets that contain personal data. So you identify the assets that you're seeking to secure, and then you evaluate each asset. When conducting a risk assessment, you take a look at the cost to create the information asset, the cost to support the information asset, and to maintain the information asset over a prolonged period. What is the maintenance cost per year? Consider the asset value to the organization, to the business, and the asset value in the marketplace. Consider the value of the organization's reputation. What is the cost? What might the potential loss be to our reputation if this information asset were to be compromised? Or if the asset were to be unavailable for a prolonged period or outside the SLA? If the SLA or the service level agreement that you have with your customers or with your staff is for your customer database system to be available 99.9% of the time, what would the cost be to your business if the asset were only available 95% of the time? So a lot of work needs to be done into evaluating the asset. What does an information classification policy contain? Well, first of all, it defines the effort required to secure your different levels of information assets or resources. So how much effort is required to secure your corporate financial statements before these have been made available to the public? Within the policy, there will also be an evaluation criteria to determine the value or sensitivity of each information asset, so that the information security team are not just guessing the value of the financial statements to the business. Rather, the criteria for your financial statements may be, when it's being created, it's top secret, and only the CFO and possibly the CEO need to have access to that document. And so security controls are applied to that financial statement whilst it's being created to ensure that only the CEO and the CFO have access, are provided with access to that financial statement. Next criteria may be, once the first draft has been released, the whole of the senior management team should have access, so we can then provide access to the entire senior management team. And then once the statements have been submitted to Companies House, we can remove all the security controls to that financial statement. So there needs to be an evaluation criteria to determine the value or sensitivity of an information asset through a time period. Because as information assets age, they may lose their value. An aircraft manufacturer that has designs for an aircraft that is yet to actually be built will classify those designs before the aircraft has been built as premium assets to be secured, to be encrypted. Whereas once the aircraft has been built, the designs no longer remain as sensitive or as confidential. Yes, they will remain the intellectual property of the aircraft manufacturer, but they don't require as stringent controls to be put in place as before the aircraft was built. All resources, all information assets require a label or a tag, and that's why you will see on PC hardware on your laptop, there will be a tag, a security tag. At the bottom of documents, you may see the confidential label or sensitive or public label. And it's the responsibility of the owner of each information asset to classify their own resources. So information security teams or IT teams do not classify the resources of an organization. It's an information assets owner that actually classifies their own resources. When conducting a risk assessment, we need to consider 3 terms. We consider risk terms, IT terms, but most importantly, we consider business terms. Business terms. How important is this asset to the business? When we're looking at a cost benefits analysis or a cost of control versus the potential loss, we need to take a look at the annual cost of implementing control, so annual maintenance as well. We need to also consider the level of risk before a control is applied and the level of risk that remains, the inherent risk that remains after the controls have been introduced. So what is the cost-benefit equation? That is, what is the value of the risk before the risk has been treated? So what is the value of the loss potentially before the risk has been treated? So that is referred to as the pre-control risk or loss. What is the post-control risk after the control has been implemented? So what is the value of the inherent risk? And then we take a look and minus from the pre-control risk and the post-control risk, we now minus the cost of implementing the control. So let's break this down now. An information security manager has identified a risk of a cyber attack against the company. And so they say, before we implement any controls, before we actually purchase a firewall, the risk to the company, if we were to experience a cyber attack, is 30K. But after we've implemented the firewall, the risk will be reduced to 20K. The cost of implementing the firewall is £5,000. So the cost benefits is the cost minus the £5,000 cost of the firewall. Tangible benefit of £5,000. So 30,000 minus 20,000 and then minus 5,000 gives us £5,000. That is just a financial benefit of £5,000. However, we cannot afford to base our control selection criteria solely on the cost and tangible benefits. We need to consider intangibles, such as what benefits might we be reaping in terms of our reputation if we were to implement this firewall? So we're not just reaping a benefit of £5,000, we're also reaping a benefit, an intangible benefit of saving our reputation or protecting our reputation from damage or loss in the event we were to be attacked. What is the responsibility of senior management when we talk about risk management? The senior management team is accountable for and responsible for risk acceptance. I repeated that because I've said that already, that SMT, rather than InfoSec, is accountable and responsible for risk acceptance. If the business is seeking to accept a risk where they're saying the cost of the controls outweigh the benefits to be reaped from applying those controls, or even if the business seeks to apply the controls and then to accept any remainder risks, because we cannot eliminate risk. If the business decides to implement controls and then to accept inherent risk, the risk that's left over, the residual risk rather, it is the responsibility of the senior management team to accept that residual risk. Apologies for referring to that as inherent risk. Inherent risk is the risk that exists by nature just because you're in business. Residual risk is the risk that is left over after controls have been applied. After you've purchased and implemented that firewall, there will still be a low level of risk. The senior management team sets the risk appetite for a company. They set the level of risk that a company is willing to tolerate, to accept. But there's no company that can simply say, we cannot accept any risks. Otherwise, that company has to simply close the doors and stop doing business, because there is inherent risk in absolutely everything we do in business and in life. What are the contents of the risk register? Well, risk register will contain a clear description of each risk. Will also contain a named risk owner, the likelihood and impact if the risk were to be left untreated, if the risk were simply accepted, then the register would need to contain the likelihood of that risk and the impact if the risk were to be simply accepted and left untreated. Then any recommended or accepted risk treatment, we're going to purchase a firewall to reduce that risk. That would need to be recorded in the register. And then the residual risk, which is the likelihood and impact of the risk materializing after the firewall has been purchased. The likelihood and impact after treatment, the residual risk, that would need to be recorded in the risk register. Then who's responsible for treating the risk? So the risk owner may be different. The risk owner for securing the financial statements that we mentioned earlier may be the chief financial officer, whereas the responsibility for securing those statements pre-release to the public will belong to the data custodians, which is IT, information technology, or InfoSec. They would be responsible for applying the controls, security controls, to that document to protect it until it has been released to public? Time scale, when will we complete this treatment by? And if the risk has been accepted to not treat the risk, then the manager accepting that, the senior manager accepting that risk, could again be the CFO in this scenario, would need to also be listed, and they would need to sign that they've accepted that risk. When was the risk last reviewed? And when is the next review planned? Remember, we said that if a risk is identified, even if the risk has been accepted, it still needs to be retained in the risk register, and it also needs to be reviewed constantly, because the likelihood may change or the potential impact may change. And that's why we monitor and review our risk register. What is the risk proximity? Let's give an example again of a data center. So we're saying we want to actually just relocate or move our data center to a county where there's been a lot of rain over the past 5 years in winter or in the autumn, in the fall. That is around August. A lot of flooding in that area. If the risk is accepted, the closer we get to August, the more the likelihood of the data center being flooded. The closer we get towards the time where the risk may materialize is referred to as the risk proximity. Here's a sample risk register that I've taken from the web, so it's not something that I've created at all. So I've just found it on a website on the web. Staff pay slips are currently sent out. So here's a description of the risk. Staff pay slips currently sent out from a third-party accountant in a PDF format. The documents are not password protected and could be intercepted in transit or at rest. Now, there is no risk owner here, but I would say that because it's to do with payroll, I could say the payroll manager. The impact, if the risk were to materialize, is 5. And the likelihood is 4, which is rather high. The risk rating has been provided as 20, that is 5 times 4. The impact times the likelihood equals the risk. And this is a qualitative risk assessment, by the way. So what is the mitigation strategy or the treatment recommended? First phase of mitigation would be to password protect the PDF files when they are sent to staff, which would mean that even if the document is intercepted, it cannot be read. The second phase would be to store the pay slips in share file and send a link to view to staff so that the document is not sent in transit, so it's not sent off. This would also provide an audit trail of the document. So the post-mitigation impact here is 2. Because even if the document were intercepted, it would not be readable simply because it's been password protected. And the post-mitigation likelihood is also reduced to 2 because a link will be sent to the member of staff rather than the payslip itself. So the post-mitigation risk now is 2 times 2, which equals 4. Besides the risk owner, the responsibility for treatment has not been included in this sample spreadsheet that I've taken from the web, and it's publicly available, which is why I haven't applied a copyright mark to it or anything like that. It's publicly available on the internet. So here's how you perform qualitative risk assessments. What is an information security framework? That is a summary of the organization's policies, standards, and procedures. Also a summary of effective information security governance. We need to monitor our information security governance to make sure it's actually effective, that it's having the required effect. Also includes incident management, how we prepare for incidents, how we respond to incidents, and how we recover from incidents. Our information security framework also includes our legal landscape. What legal obligations are placed upon our company? And I always say that to information security professionals as well, understand the legal and regulatory landscape of your company. Make sure you don't go in there blind. If you're working in a charity, understand what the Charity Commission, which is based in the UK, requires of charities. If you're in the UK and you work in the financial services sector, understand what the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulatory Authority also requires of your organization, including with regards to information security. Understand any related national and international standards that apply to your company. PCI DSS for credit card merchants, ISO 27001, if your company is actually registered for that, Cyber Essentials, if you're a government organization in the UK. All of this contributes to your firm's information security framework. Legal framework. When you're outsourcing to third parties, ensure that contractual safeguards are included in the form of information security clauses, considering third and fourth party controls with regards to IT issues and, most importantly, data protection. We can't afford to simply outsource our data to third-party providers like our recruitment data, for example, our employee data. We can't afford to outsource without understanding where the recruitment provider, which is our third party, stores our employee data. So we need to ensure that our fourth parties, we understand the controls that they have in place to protect our employee data. Because when an employee or a candidate applies for a job in our company, they're not going to ask questions of our fourth or third party in the event of a data breach. They will be asking questions of us. So we need to make sure that in our contracts that we include clauses that ensure that our third and fourth parties understand that they need to secure our candidates and our employee data as if they are us.